Alright, great. Okay, hi everyone, my name is Readiness, Filipino Scientist.
Laurie.
Alright, just a few friendly reminders. I will try to time you guys, but it's also heavily recommended that you also time your opponents as well as yourself. I'm going to keep track whenever I can. There's also a bell attached to this. Okay, so this will indicate the first 6 and 7 minutes of the round. What any further delays? Prime Minister on the EU motion. Okay.
So first thing, what does this readiness look like? We think it looks like two things. First, investing in military or defense or other supply chains that might be included inside this landscape of war. This is including, for example, electricity that might be things that basically Russia can use to sanction you to force you to actually give up your territory, etc. This is connected as well as investing in. It's also going to help grow the industry in the long term. This means they're not just going to buy stuff from others, but also build what is necessary infrastructure that they're going to need in the future. Secondly, we think it looks like strengthening diplomatic relationships within the EU. So if they have some sort of diverse ideology that's splitting them apart, they're going to come together and talk about it and hopefully reach some sort of consensus so that there aren't more disagreements within that can be exploited by external actors in the future, right? Secondly, what is the incentives of multiple actors involved? We think, first thing we think they want regional stability. They want not as many immigrants falling out of Ukraine. They also want economic stability, and they have heavy economic reliance on Ukraine, given how a lot of food is coming from Ukraine, and how you have a country that largely the market is just very, very unstable in the region. Secondly, what is the incentive of Russia? Within the incentive of Russia is extremely simple. They are able to take advantage of the situation where Ukraine is not protected, or where the EU is unable or unwilling to step up and actually protect them, and external actors are also unwilling to do so. They are able to take short-term advantage from them, for example, having a good relationship with the US, but within the long term, they are unable to give up, for example, their global stance or doing other things, for example, doing sanctions. They are unable to give up, trade off a lot of things just to get such a small land Ukraine, right? Third, then, what is the incentive of the US that the Ukraine is currently relying on to get most of its support? We think they just want to leverage the situation to get as much profit out of this as possible. This is like selling people military defense things so that the industry of this can make a lot of money. They just want to exploit EU's industrial supply chains that can fill in this hole, right? We think this is extremely important. Before I say something more.
Yeah, that's why the US and NATO is likely to stay if the EU suddenly decides to incorporate new countries and mix up defense systems and suddenly it tries to run away from NATO in its geopolitical stance, because that would be changing geopolitical stance.
We don't think US is, I think there is no way US is just going to go and be like, oh, we're going to very, very explicitly give up on all these democratic ideologies that we already have. Therefore, even if they don't contribute as like substantial of an amount, they won't be doing radical backlashing. But we think even if we trade off that US won't be contributing so much as I've explained, it's actually a good thing because they're not trying to exploit the situation to fit their own factors. Why do we think principally it's very important that we do this? Firstly, we think EU is an economic-based region, therefore their economic incentives should weigh over other things in this debate. But secondly, we think that the best actor to be able to protect Ukraine in the long term, so they have the more responsibility to do so, as EU is already like an established, the people's minds already established as an organization that should sort of protect each other. And they also act in Ukraine's best interest because of geographical proximity compared to other external actors. Why is it that oppositions likely claim that backlash from Russia isn't something worth considering? We think they are largely able to survive the short-term pressure of Russia claiming this is a bad thing, but in the long term, as long as we are trying to promote regional stability, the short-term tension is very, very easy to trade off, given how EU is already stepping up and having leverage in this current status quo. We think the long-term stability is something that we have to consider in this debate, and we have to solve the common points as well. Therefore, very powerful.
Yeah, hello.
So, first of all, some rebuttals to government case and then moving on to my case. So, first, government says that passing R2030 will strengthen regional stability within the EU, because that will lead to countries within the EU like being diplomatically good with each other. We see that it's in this case, in the status quo, it's actually third-party countries like the US that helps the EU agree on certain matters. Because in the EU, there's a lot of different opinions on different things, right? So we see that because countries like the US is such a big superpower that they are in the status quo the only solution to which like these countries, like to get these countries to agree on matters. So we see that we see that passing R2030 is not good because it will lead to the US drifting apart from Europe.
We think it is exactly because US is a bad actor, so we have to enact this plan so that EU can protect themselves instead of relying on external organizations as already explained.
What we're saying is that if you don't have these actors like mitigating like discourse within the EU itself, then the EU will like have more disagreement, and that's bad. Okay, so moving on to our case. So first of all, some characterization. So we believe that so in the status quo, it's EU is a economic agreement within the European countries, right? And NATO is a nuclear pact and agreement amongst different countries like the EU and US against Russia. So why do we think that the EU drifting apart from UK and US is bad? Is because it's going to lead to a more independent EU. So if we there's going to be less cohesion between these between EU and other countries, and less interoperability. So and second, it also leads to more vocal belligerent countries within the EU. There's going to be some countries that will agree with this and some countries that will disagree with this R2030. So what that leads to is these countries, it like raises the tension between these countries so that like when like actual times of crisis and conflict happen, they can't agree and make a decision. And also, because this conflict happens, Russia will then like exploit this conflict with propaganda and hybrid war, and leading to disunity within the EU. And okay, now that's what happens within the EU. And so what happens like with the EU and international relations is that US will pivot to supporting other countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia because they think that because they can't make any more profit from the EU, so there's no demand, so there's no profit, so they have no incentive to actually stay with the EU. So no. So these two countries, not these two, these two powers will drift apart, and that means that the US is less likely to come to Europe's aid if anything happens. So why would this actually happen is first the profit incentive, right? So if the US industries can't sell to Europe anymore because there's no demand from Europe, then US and US industries have no incentive to like stay and support Europe. And second is domestic politicians within the US will say that like they don't need to fund Europe anymore because clearly Europe can like handle these problems on their own, right? But no. But we see that this all leads to Europe and the UK drifting apart. Now, why is this bad? It's because the US and UK are like very big nuclear powers, right? And they spent a lot of money on defense, way more than R2030 proposes to, right? So, why this is bad is because nuclear weapons are they're the ultimate war deterrent, right? So if something is going to happen, then there's never been a nuclear war because people are too scared of wiping out entire race of humanity. But if these two powers drift apart, then the US won't go to war for Europe anymore, right? And even if they still would, Russia would think that the US won't support the EU that much. So what this means is that Russia can attack countries like Latvia and Estonia and the Baltic countries because they dare to, because they think that the US will not stop them. There's no repercussions, right? So guys, deterrence only works if the threat is credible. If I point a gun at you and tell you to do something, you only do it if you think the gun is loaded. If you think that I'm just posturing, then nothing will happen. So this is why I'm so proud to oppose.
Hello, EPM.
rebutting what opposition just mentioned. Firstly, they talked about disagreement within the European Union. I want to firstly point out on the status quo. I think EU already has a clear picture in mind of how they're going to deal with the war between Russia and Korea, right? They want to end the war, and secondly, they want to separate Ukraine instead of the country that is continually invading and putting humanitarian use upon Ukraine. So I think the possibility of disagreement is pretty small. But even if there's disagreement, I think there'll be disagreement. But the efforts that we put in to solve this disagreement is probably pretty low compared to the time frame, 10 decades or decades later, right? I think Susie already pointed out one very important thing, that 2030 is quite critical right now. Because they have an existing awareness and an existing common ground in status quo of how dangerous war could be. If we consider like 2050 or 2060, they already lost the continuous awareness of how Ukraine and Russia suffers from the war, right? So I think the possibility of having disagreement in EU is much likely to happen under their side of the house. They also talked about they want to be more independent. I think the problem is that they rely too heavily and too much on US and UK, which is not part of the European Union, right? Because EU holds a principle of not putting too much budget or not putting too much effort in carry around a weapon, right? Because they don't have much power to counter whenever time the crisis happens. I think their side of the house cannot argue that the weapon is too dangerous or going to impact their economic advantage, because the weapon that we're talking about is only about defensive. But even if US is drifting off, I think it was fine, right? Let's compare the time frame, right? In the short term, sure, maybe US can help, but you know that right now in the status quo, Trump administration is slowly taking away their aid for Ukraine, right? But in the long term, it's hard for us to forecast that US will continuously help help any countries that will potentially happen a war with Ukraine, right? With Russia, right? I think I want to first refrain about what incentives of the European Union is likely to happen, right? Firstly, Ukraine has agriculture, which in the past is offered and sold to European unions. But once the war happens, right, these agriculture are now offered by US and UK, which is very unstable for food supply and unstable in economic trade, right? For example, terrorists from the Trump administration took the economic advantage that EU once had, right? Note that European Union is a union that heavily relies on trade and economic benefits, right? They definitely wouldn't want to rely on US and UK again in the near future or the long-term future, right? And secondly, I think EU needs further cooperation and a sense of united within the union as well. Because A, US taking an advantage and making it more conflict within the European Union. But B, because of UK leaving EU, it made EU look weaker, lost trust within the people itself. Note that EU itself is heavily built on cooperation in the very first place. So the incentives to sum up is, firstly, they get a stable food chain, but secondly, they take back their position in the international community. Once belongs to them, but now is now taken by the Trump administration, right? But why putting Ukraine in this picture in 2030 can actually process this goal is that A, by providing and working more on defensive weapons, it showcases that you have capacity to protect your own allies and own campaigns instead of fully rely on US or on UK, right? It shows US that themselves have the capacity, right? But not that the status quo, there's a lot of criticism surrounding on the lack of protection from the EU. Yes, I'll take point.
Please analyze how likely it is that Russia actually attacks any other country in the EU. All of them are currently NATO. All of them have the support. Any conflict larger than one in Ukraine would probably trigger World War III. Analyze why Russia could ever possibly attack EU.
I think right now in the status quo, we can see that after so long, after 3 or 4 years of Russia continuously attacking Ukraine, I think it's unclear for me of how Russia do not have the incentive to continue attack Ukraine. I'm kind of moving on to why to further prevention or to prevent from further safety is such an important thing, right? And why I think a lot of people have mistaken this notion about Ukraine is not part of EU, so EU don't have incentive to protect them. I think the plan. Future prevention is a plan that every nation is making, right? EU countries have suffering from the Russia-Ukraine war, and this is exactly the reason they cannot bear another risk of further war or further conflict within the region, right? The war between Ukraine and Russia is not only impacting in these two countries, but it's also impacting on the European Union, right? For example, refugees come in other countries. They cannot, coming from Ukraine, go to other countries are already taking away a lot of their advantages, and protests within the country is already happening. Thus, they need an urgent action to put on and show the international community that they are taking Ukraine under the shelter instead of leaving them away out of the picture, right? I think they cannot bear another invasion. And I think it's the comparison between like risking if there's a war in the near future, or risking that Russia do not have incentive later. I think there's also a potential economic benefit, right? Right now, I think another reason why EU is slowly losing their advantage in economics is because people generally know that there's a risk and there's a potential danger happening in Europe, right? We can see that since European Union is heavily reliant on the UK and the US right now, and they're losing a lot of their economic advantage, I think other countries, it's possible that they will be slowly turning their trade actors to some other country, for example, like Southeast Asia. Thus, I think this is very detrimental for EU as a union that fully relies on economic basis, right? So I think potential economic benefits is able to achieve if they conclude Ukraine to show that they themselves not only have the capacity to support their economic chains and to support their food chains, but also have the capacity to secure region safety. And it's also beneficial, and also another thing that can attract further trade internationally. For reasons above, so I'm to propose.
Am I on? Okay. Because I'm sitting. Yeah. Everything's good? Yep. Okay. I'm going to start off with new material. The DPM has not refuted that the United States and the United Kingdom will drift away. I'll build those warrants later. But another implication of this is that there will be nuclear proliferation in Europe. First of all, is if the United States and the United Kingdom are unreliable, then fundamentally NATO as a defense pact is shaken to its core. This means that these countries cannot reliably rely on nuclear protections, so they are likely to seek their own nuclear weapons. Secondly, Readiness 2030 supplies a lot of defense money, and that defense money is far more likely going to be pursuing a nuclear option because it's the most effective weapon in a deterrent. So this is why there would be an incentive for these countries to seek nuclear weapons. This would result in war because A, there would be a Russian first strike. If a country were to develop a nuclear weapon and Russia has spies everywhere, they would see that there would be development of this or detect it via satellites, which you can do for uranium. And then this would result in a Russian first strike of a country because it wants to prevent them from accessing a nuclear weapon. Secondly, a violation of the NPT would explicitly cause cascade of proliferation across the world, causing Iran and the Middle East to proliferate, Asia, Japan, Korea, etc., all to proliferate because international law does not hold anymore, and now there's cascading proliferation, all of which, at the very least, causes arms racing because countries are now building up their militaries because they're afraid of other sides having a nuclear weapon. All of this will lead to nuclear war. Yes?
They have no incentive to purchase a nuclear weapon because EU is an economic-based country. If they do this, very likely to lose their cooperations internationally.
The very reason that they will seek a nuclear weapon is because they feel as though they do not have international cooperation. The very argument we are making, the mechanism we are making is if the United States and the United Kingdom drift apart from the EU, then there will be engaging in proliferation, which is exactly why they will pursue this. But let's take them at their best. Proliferation will still occur because security outweighs all other political concerns. In Germany, in Poland, there is political support, leading support right now. As you can see, there's rising populism. However, security concerns will always outweigh because a regime wants to stay in power and wants to avoid war at all costs. And at worst, they can always change the law. So this political support argument doesn't make sense. Plus, they have money because Readiness 2030 will fund them, and there will be expertise in materials, all of which will cause proliferation. If you do not know how to resolve a Russia war debate in the top half, you do know that a proliferation scenario is external from all of this Russia war scenario because it's another reason for why war would occur, and it has the potential for global impacts in World War III because it would affect regions like the Middle East and Asia, etc. Now, on to the actual substance of the debate. The DPM says, essentially, time frame is really important. But the biggest thing to consider for all of this is the profit incentive argument that we've given to you. There's a profit incentive for the United States and the United Kingdom to continue to sell weapons to the rest of the EU. That profit incentive is gone when the EU spends $800 billion on its own economy. And just to keep in mind, the scope of profit that these countries have is far bigger because the defense spending that you could get from the United Kingdom in the United States is like around $1.5 trillion as opposed to $800 trillion, which is a much bigger impact on defense. So even if they do account for this a little bit, they wouldn't fully account for all of this. Second of all, that they have not answered our argument that there would be domestic political support. The United States and the United Kingdom would have politicians screaming, saying, why are we spending taxpayer dollars on other countries when they are funding for themselves? All of this means that there's no reason for the United States to defend all of these countries. This would cause a Russia war because if there's, also, third of all, is there's no demand, then these countries would sell to other countries like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, etc., and Asia, etc. If they do not sell to these countries, then the NATO alliance is void. Article 5 of NATO is premised upon defending another country. If the United States were to genuinely defend another country, they would have to actually defend its commitments credibly. A credible defense commitment requires financial backing. If you're not even financially backing anyone, then it's just words on paper, which means that these commitments will be fundamentally void, and Russia will fundamentally think that this is suspicious. This is the only scenario for escalation beyond Ukraine, because Ukraine will be limited in conflict, but if NATO is called into suspect and Russia starts probing, then all of the arguments that the Prime Minister said about how cyber war will start, how electricity will start, etc., Russia will start engaging in those actions to test whether or not the commitments between the United States and Europe are truly together. Yes?
Assuming we are not so much smarter than the whole US and EU diplomats aggregated, if these concerns are real, we don't think they're going to do whatever it is that they were going to do. They're going to have their own evaluations and realize they cannot build nuclear power, or they cannot pull away.
Okay, so if your argument is we are dumber than diplomats, I would encourage you to look at things like the Iraq War, etc. All the cases where diplomats made stupid decisions. But ultimately, I think the case is very clear. There is a profit incentive now. That profit incentive would go away, which means that the United States and the United Kingdom would drift apart. That might not break the whole alliance, or be charitable to you, but what would happen is Russia would start to probe and test that weakness to see how far that alliance is separating, and they would perceive the commitment of NATO as not credible and would start to engage in all of the arguments that they've said, like electricity and cyber war, threatening agriculture, etc., which all flip onto our side. Now, their argument about the United States and the United Kingdom are not reliable. If they try to bring this up as well as CG, I'll sort of defend against the Trump is not reliable push. One, a profit incentive to cooperate ignores Trump. Second, it's not true because Trump is just doing a lot of rhetoric, and the Department of State and Congress are all much, much bigger than Trump, and Trump is just one president, and there will be many, many other presidents where a profit incentive will encourage them to cooperate with Russia, with Europe. Okay, now WHAM. War is horrible, it collapses economies, it's expensive, it kills civilians, all of which turns all the refugees' arguments. There's no reason that EU being an economic power is good. If the economy is good, war would obviously collapse that. All of the arguments that they're going to make is going to be derivative if it's premised upon a Russia war, because they're all premised upon the NATO alliance being hollow or weak, or Russia never going to war. All of those arguments presuppose our arguments about why the United States and Europe are drifting apart from each other in the first place. All of the labor economy arguments are going to get much worse. Tariffs are going to get much worse when these countries depart from one another. I don't think the Ukraine economy is relevant because they are going to help, the EU is going to help Ukraine, not the United States. The United States is a benevolent actor. Proud to advise.
I think the opening opposition team somehow framed like this. 2013 agenda is just going to happen instantly, and then all supports from America is going to be cut instantly, which is simply not the case. So in my speech today, I'm going to start off with some rebuttals and move on to my arguments. Main rebuttal I have is that they said that their main argument is there's a money incentive for the U.S. to support the EU, right? Which is true. I think the first reason is profit too is because of the geopolitical position that EU is positioned, which is very close to Russia, which is why they need to support them in order as their first defense when Russia really decides to attack. Right? So that's the second layer of a reasoning as to why US will support them, right? So your first one is about profit. I think they said that once this money incentive is cut off, America is no longer going to support the EU, right? Which I think, and Russia will come to exploit the uncertainty of EU with it, right? I think that's not the case. I don't think it's just going to happen instantly. I think it's going to be something gradually that EU starts to self-sustain and then stops to have like money funded by the America. And at the point that they completely don't need the support from US, it means they are able to self-sustain. It means they are able to defend themselves. It means they have the capability to not be so vulnerable in the face of Russia. So I don't think your case of like Russia exploiting the EU because of this time frame where there's this transition of being self-sustained is going to stand, right? So moving on to my argument. The first argument I have is about why it's so important to have balance of power in the world today, right? So we think that if EU relies too much on the US and UK, it's very likely that it creates a lot of tension between two countries or two ideologies, right? Like Russia and then China and then America and these Western countries, right? I think this is extremely bad because right now two forces are on the very brink of a war because they have so much tension towards one another. Whereas on our side, if we have this EU, right, it's very easy that we delegate and dilute these kind of attention towards different countries, which means it's going to be very less likely that one country or one or ideology is going to directly target the other one, right? So this also avoids bandwagon, and we would like to question on their side of the house. How is it guaranteed that the US is going to support the UK or the EU right away? I don't think financial incentive is enough, right? We see that the cross-trade issue. Yes, America sells a lot of stuff to us. We throw a lot of money to them, right? But it's still not guaranteed that we, as a country, will be protected if China invades, because it is clearly shown that that we are geographically so far away from it, right? So I think they don't think that was said. So my first argument is that we will prevent the next war and bring more peace to the world. Yeah.
So you said that there's no guarantee that the United States would support them, but you acknowledge that the United States has a profit incentive, and your argument is that they're over-reliant on the United States. How can you resolve this contradiction for me?
No, okay.
So you said that Europe is currently over-reliant on the United Kingdom and Europe, or the United Kingdom and the United States, but then you said, how can we guarantee that this will happen when you acknowledge that there's a profit incentive right now? That seems contradictory.
No, let me tell you that profit is the first reason. The second reason is about deterrence, right? That's the incentive for the America, right? And the profit part, I don't think it's just going to instantly go away. So there is still some level of profit involved in this, in the very beginning stage of this 2030 agenda, right? Move on to my second argument, which is why independence defense organization is so important, right? We think self-autonomy is extremely important because the US, the UK, these prominent figures, their interest is always going to come first, right? So when Russia has so much deterrence on the UK or on the EU, it's very likely that US and UK, when they see this kind of shift towards them or this kind of deterrence, it's very likely that they put, if it's like these two weigh between benefit themselves or protecting EU because of financial issues. I don't think protecting for the EU is gonna necessarily stand right. So I think it's very important that we leverage the geopolitical advantages on our side of the house, that the EU becomes self-sustaining, self-autonomous. Right? So the third one is more about the financial side, which is military-industrial alliances. I think this is good because we on our side of the house, we can accumulate the wealth and resources into a union, right? Which means every country that has their own benefits, let's say it's steel or coal or agriculture, I think when it comes together, it's very likely that it's very easy for them to distribute these kind of resources within the union. And I think the good part about this is that money is circulated within the country, which means it's able to develop a better economic status within the country and not rely on external factors and be deterred by financial sanctions or something like that, right? And another point is that countries are ready for war. Countries in this union, this 2030 union, is ready for war and is prepared to counter like Russia, right? So I think one last one is about I'm gonna address the nuclear proliferation that you guys brought up. I don't think the nuclear war won't happen because yes, if we take the best scenario that you have, that is this EU committee somehow come up or to see if we made this nuclear. I don't think war is just gonna happen right away, right? So many things at stake. I think it's very likely that countries with power will come together and deliberate some sort of agenda to protect our nations from bombing out one another, right? So I don't think that's gonna happen. Like nuclear proliferation is not gonna likely happen. And so for all these reasons, very opposed.
I will win this debate in two steps. Firstly, I'll prove you that this counterfactual, everything we're talking about, is not true because the characterization of status quo is so incomplete in this debate. So wrong. Secondly, I'm going to bring you unique arguments that win us over opening opposition and arguments that go against the government bench, right? Firstly, let's ask ourselves some questions. Where is money likely to be spent? This 800 billion money, right? It is likely going to be spent in the EU, so we're talking about EU defense project, right? So we have to characterize EU as an entity and whether they want this or not, but more on this later, right? Secondly, we have to see how EU is doing right now. Firstly, economically, it might be struggling because it is not, it doesn't have the best growth rate. They're investing a lot of money into trying to grow their economy. They do not want to stagnate, right? So they need money. This is the first characterization. Secondly, they are strong. They are so underperforming underrepresenting the power of the EU militarily, right? We have to recognize that those are developed countries. They are not some like third world countries without militaries. There are all countries with specialized military forces. Majority of them are part of NATO, right? And they have nukes. Something that the government literally forgets is that France has nukes. We have to mention this. France has nukes, and Germany and Switzerland are believed to be dormant nuke countries where they literally could develop in amount the nukes. And this is very important at the point where we tell you that there is an actual nuclear deterrent on their side, so World War III is not likely to happen, right? We have to consider a realistic world because we know that nuclear war cannot happen because this debate literally doesn't happen yet, right? We're considering realistic rules. Then is NATO breakup likely to happen, right? Well, they tell you that it is likely to happen. We come to a consensus in this debate. We believe that it is in NATO's or US's interest to keep NATO because of two reasons, right? It's geographical reasons, right? Then it's profit incentives for the war industry and also potentially trade, right? We have to recognize that trade is very important in this debate because if we characterize EU as something that's struggling economically and US is the biggest trading partner, we need that connection, right? It's in the EU's incentive to trade with the US. This is going to be important when we consider what happens with the money, right? And last thing that we have to consider is the actual status quo. What is happening to the war? The war is stagnating. Trump is literally saying that we're going to solve it. If Trump tells you that we're going to solve it, you know that everything is already good because he can solve like literally everything, right? We tell you that likely the conflict is coming to an end because both Russia and Ukraine are divided because we see that this is nonsense because the international community is dissatisfied, right? We tell you that Russia isn't going to attack. Second thing, because Europe is strong, Russia will never attack. This debate cannot be about Russia attacking because we believe that even if NATO doesn't exist, even if the European Union doesn't exist, if Russia attacks Latvia or Finland or anything, the world will stand up. It will be World War II over again. We are not debating this scenario because we're telling you that countries have common sense. If Russia goes on a hike like Germany, we're going to stop it regardless of what the world is, right? We're not going to have fights. Thirdly, we tell you nukes are not likely to happen. This is an extreme scenario, right? We have nuclear deterrence already on our side, so investing in military is not that important for the EU, right? Couple of distinctions that I'm going to make. Firstly, we tell you that we blow them out of the water because we prove you that nukes are important and we still have the deterrent, right? There are arguments of contingent on the US having to protect Europe. We tell you that Europe can protect itself. It has the deterrence and it also has different incentives, which is what my argument will be about. Secondly, we blow them out of the water because we tell you that they're argumentable. The opening government doesn't exactly tell you what we should invest in. They tell you, but yeah, you should upgrade the grids, you should upgrade things that are also going to benefit you economically. Notice that that is already done because that is separate from the military. When we talk about the military, we have to talk about EU upgrading its stance about everything else, right? And we have to see if this is actually incentive and an incentive of people, because if it's not in the EU's incentive, it will likely underperform with those resources, right? We realize that this is not an actor's motion, right? But EU actually wants to have these things, like it has to be beneficial for the EU to have those things that they're investing in, because otherwise they won't just use it in the intent, therefore, like the arguments they're making on the OG won't succeed, right? And no move on my arguments. Firstly, we tell you that it is against EU principles, against EU voters to implement those policies, right? Firstly, we see that EU is a cornerstone of political peace, of like human rights, etc., etc. It is facilitating that in the UN. It is having its aid sent to Ukraine. It is having its aid sent to other countries. It is literally investing like $80 billion per year just to help other countries with their aid, helping other countries like improve, right? We see that EU is advocating for peace. Its policy is never to like get involved into something, maybe define, but never anything more than that, right? We tell you that this is something that EU wants. And EU people want the same, right? EU people want economic empowerment. They do not want to stagnate. $800 billion is likely to come out of their tax budgets, right? And at the point where EU is literally spending $800 billion per like 3 years for their economic improvement as their whole budget, you cannot tell me that in those 5 years, throwing in $100 billion is going to be effective. Right? This is our first argument. Second, we tell you, is this actually going to be effective, right? Consider $800 billion. This is way less than the US budget, and we have way more military right there. We're telling you that this money, well, it is a lot in terms of economy, it is not a lot in terms of military, therefore it is not effective. We can spend it better. This is our second argument, right? We tell you that this is bad use of money. Why? Because we have counterfactuals. We have humanitarian aid. We have things such as investing in like people. We have investing in like refugees. We have investing in like promoting the EU economy, which can make it also stronger, like economically, which is a trickle-down effect where you got like EU stronger economically, therefore better ties with US, therefore less conflict, right? And if the EU strengthens like economically, it can also help Ukraine better, right? Humanitarianly. We're not talking about military, because we have Russia as a deterrent. We have Russia, we do not want to have conflict, because this, I like literally tell you, is the principle of the EU. It will never try to intervene if it's not, tell us.
No opening bench so far has engaged with our point on how external actors are inherently unreliable, given how, for example, America goes to Africa and does all these things while they're trying to negotiate, but in fact sacrifices autonomy. As they're already doing.
Okay, what we're telling you, this isn't necessarily important, Elizabeth. You also went over the limit, right? But we're telling you that for the EU, it is important to be EU. It is important for the EU to do things that they do, right? We were telling that EU is likely more humanitarian, right? Second argument here is undermining NATO. A lot of countries in like the EU are already in NATO, and like mixing and matching would be bad. Firstly, because you would get into an argument with NATO, which means the primary incentive of the EU, which is like economics, would get divorced because NATO is basically connected to US. That like the industrial warmongering system is connected with other fields, which is bad, right? And thirdly, we tell you that this would likely lead to conflict escalation. Some sort of conflict escalation will happen, either with the US damaging economy or with Russia, like Russia intensifying conflict again in the Ukraine. We tell you Russia is weak, but Russia is only weak enough to not attack Europe. But Russia is strong enough to like continue the war in Ukraine, which is already attacked, right? And we're telling you that to prevent like economic disparity in Europe and to prevent like Russia putting more pressure in Ukraine at the point of which the conflict is already calming down, we have to not implement this policy. Thank you.
Ukraine war is not going to stop soon, right? Meaning that you are not going to rely on external actors in the long term. Tim already told you, balance of power is important in international relations. It's not smart to make America's power keep strengthening, right? As this is going to be a marathon, I also don't trust Trump as a reckless leader can carefully take the balance. Super proud to propose this motion. 3 things in my speech then. Firstly, clarifications, 2 rebuttals, and then thank waiting. I think firstly, basically the opening of the to tell you that we have a contradiction on the reliance part. But we tell you that in the current status quo we see in the cross-strait issue, even though we are so committed, even though we are so reliant on this on America, and we also sign some agreement, but at the end, I think that a lot of the statistics also tell you that we are not going to we don't really know whether US will come to help us, right? So I think that is a key point that why we shouldn't over-rely on this on America and also the UK part, right? But moving on to some bench weight, but first, regarding to the CEO, right? I think CEO tell you a point about trade is important, but we believe that without this kind of weapon, we are also trading kind of services and products with America and also the UK, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't trade weapon with them, then we lose the trade of services and also the products. But secondly, we tell you that because you are still relying on the US, meaning that you are not going to have a large autonomy to actually decide how much you are going to how much things you are going to push into the military, right? So I don't think it is a smart decision for European Union to not operate on their own, right? But they are trying to tell you that it will actually, their first argument are basically telling you that you're actually against people's opinion or something. But we believe that even if EU's goal is going to maintain peace, but we believe that this Readiness 2030 is more like a defensive program instead of an offensive program, right? So I think at the end, the essence of this program is still maintaining peace, right? And they are also talking about a lot of things about tax. But we believe that it is actually symmetrical on both sides. Why? Because you are also going to spend the tax where you rely on the US, right? And it is even more risky because Trump basically would put some unreasonable tariff or additional tax on this kind of thing. But before I move on,
so your argument about Trump putting in an unreasonable tax and how you're turning all the profit incentive, trade, use of money arguments, how can this make any sense in a world where the United States is now drifting apart from Europe? Why would they just not impose harsher tariffs and with no?
Sure, we are willing to concede that US and UK are drifting away. Why? Because we tell you that when we tell you the concept of balance of power, what is the concept of balance of power? Is that you are not going to always strengthen a side that already have its own forces, right? When all the European Union are going to support the US, they are going to be super strong. So high possibility this time America will have the incentive to do other action to control these European Union countries. So actually also to invade, to even involve or interfere into the Russia and Ukraine war. And we tell you that what's the minority and what's the stakeholder you need to care about in the current status quo, right? It is the minority, it is the people, it is the civilian in the European area, right? So I don't think that even if these countries are drifting away, but we don't really care about that because we see that the current Russia-Ukraine war are not going to stop in a very soon time. Right? So our goal is going to prevent another war from happening or prevent the war from amplifying, right? So it is on our side that we better guarantee the civilian rights and civilian lives. But moving on to the bench weighing, right? I think OG give you a great argument on the stability and also the econ part. But we tell you, but I believe that there have missing mechanisms here. We tell you a better argument by telling you about the balance of power argument, which is telling you that why we shouldn't over-rely on these kind of external actors, right? We tell you because balance of even if the opposition bench trying to push with something like nuclear proliferation argument, but we tell you balance of power is more likely to happen because US are going to have more incentive to invade other countries. And even if nuclear proliferation happens, we tell you that I think they are just meta-impacting this kind of thing, right? Because there are already existing agreements, and also we believe that everyone in the world will be scrutinizing our European Union if they are doing something that is not great for the globe, right? So I don't think so I think that their point about nuclear proliferation is just meta-impacting. But moving on back to OG, right? I think we already tell you why on our side better explain why we shouldn't over-rely on these kind of external actors because you are just bandwagoning, right? You are not exerting your own influence on your own autonomy, right? But I think they are also talking about economic part. But he already tell you that on our side we are going to guarantee the military and industrial alliances, meaning that this kind of steel and this kind of coal is going to be comes from this kind of European region and this kind of small country, which actually boosts the economy, right? Because when you over-rely on this kind of US, you will actually receive public backlash because people will feel like, oh, why are we spending too much money on US instead of we use our own forces and we use our industries to actually boost our own power, right? But moving on to OO, I think OO has a lot of recent impacts. I think basically their first arguments are already challenged about disagreement and also the US drifting apart. But they're trying to talk about the US drifting apart point. But I already successfully challenged them by telling you about the point of balance of power. Why balance of power is more important than nuclear proliferation? Because we see that nuclear proliferation is not going to have a high possibility from happening to have a negative impact, right? But balance of power is more important because anytime Trump will do an unreasonable or reckless decision to actually invade other country or have the incentive to actually control other countries. But moving back to CO, I think CO, I think I already tell you a lot of how CO have no substantial extension because they are only telling. I think they're also magnifying the impact by only telling you, oh, this will actually lead to people actually backlash and also why are they paying the tax. But I don't think on their side they're actually telling you that how on their side is going to maintain the peace and how on their side is going to stop the incentive for this US country to actively interfere into the affairs of this European Union. So we actually tell you that this kind of EU can actively act as a role to actually have the independent defense power and have the independent defense autonomy, and meaning that they at the same time can protect the civilian and the people, because we are not going to trust US as a sense for in the cross issue. We are not going to always trust the America to actually save us, right? So very proud to propose.
Three, two, one. This was a bit of a massive debate, so I'm really sorry if this isn't going to be the most structured speech, but who can blame me? First of all, before going into the clashes I found in this debate, I'd like to just say a couple of things that I think either went completely unrebutted or are still very important in this part of the debate. Again, I would like to stress, the USA, the reason we can partially rely on it, and the NATO, irrespective of what, is because the USA has an incentive to trade with Europe. Europe, in the European Union especially, are its biggest partners since like the last, I don't know, 100 years. And the reason that Trump maybe looks very strong on the surface, but behind the, like, his charades and all of the theatrics he does, actually they have a lot of problems with China. They're competing in China in terms of like economic growth, in terms of potential conflict right here in Taiwan, in terms of everything that could go wrong on that side, and the US is very worried about, and thus cannot afford another conflict with the European Union, meaning that likely it has, first of all, an economic and political incentive, first of all, to stand with Europe, and secondly, Europe also offers more than just that, even if we disregard all of that, which is just the sheer like geographical vantage points the European Union offers, such as closeness to Russia, which gives like US access for all of their things that they want to do. Now, with that out of the way, I just like to point that like our argument about like the perspective of like EU values and what EU citizens want just went completely unrebutted in this debate, and I'd like to just reiterate why it's very important. First of all, we believe that, you know, any responsible democracy such as the European Union should respect the wishes of its like people, and the European Union is a cornerstone of like human rights, peace, helping each other, humanitarian aid, meaning that like simply militarizing themselves for the sake of like potential threats is not something that would be aligned with, first of all, the citizens' views, and secondly, even more importantly, would cause worldwide panic. Now imagine if the one entity that stands at the top of the world in terms of like justice and whatnot, holds majority of these institutions within its territories, would now start to get very militarized, would be prepared to attack, would even develop nuclear weapons, to which I'll get in a bit. No, thank you. We believe that this would cause widespread panic, and we simply believe that this is a very important point in the debate that simply goes unnoticed until this point. And now with this out of the way, I'll just go into the first clash, which is kind of this war safety and what happens on that front, whether or not the Readiness 2030 is implemented. What we get from essentially both government sides is that, you know, we should invest in like European Union safety because of all the potential conflicts that are going to happen, on the reliance of like NATO, of the US, of how European Union should do this for their own economy because it's becoming a threat to it, which again I'll get to in a minute. But however, what I want to characterize is that they severely underplay how strong the European Union is. It's likely the second, third strongest entity in international relations, and it cannot just be messed with on any front. Then secondly, they kind of overestimate how much UK and the US helps. I didn't hear a single example where the UK was actually helping in anything. They completely forgot and just kind of kept mentioning it. Okay, then US, you can talk about investment into Ukraine, but fine, we tell you that the European Union matched the investment, if not even made it better, since we didn't give them loans, we actually gave them money that they could have spent on their defenses, unlike the United States. And then what we get from opening opposition here is also kind of interesting. This proliferation of nuclear powers, which, sure, let's play with it, but we simply believe that this is a very, very, very high burden that they failed to prove. Irrespective of what, if it's true or not, we simply believe that what's more likely to happen, on the other hand, is that, you know, war is ending. Okay, don't take Trump's word for it, take Putin's word. Putin, a dictator who was always in his like 20, 30 years of dictatorship, always right, was prepared to accede and was prepared to stop the conflict. If you don't take Trump's word, then take Putin. War is ending, Russia is exhausted. Then second, I have already explained that NATO has an incentive. And then thirdly, we tell you that in any case, 800 billion is on their side of the house, likely not large enough to make any substantive difference in terms of European Union's defenses. Why? First of all, you have to spend it across 28 different countries, which are very fractionalized, and it's really hard to do this. And secondly, we tell you that the United States by itself spends more in 1 year than we would by 2030, meaning that this is simply not enough here. Then, on the other hand, we tell you that in terms of the second clash, the European Union should actually use this money as a counterfactual to strengthen its economy. The only other thing that kind of really addresses economy here is opening government, with kind of this assertive argument that, you know,
European Union needs to establish safety because people are kind of fleeing from investment because they see it as potentially risky. But I'd just like to assess the truthfulness of this. What other place in the European Union can you find that's about as safe? Likely not many. We believe that this is an assertion that's simply not correct. The European Union is extremely safe, except for Ukraine, meaning that there's not really any fear that's existing here, meaning that this isn't the priority where they should focus. On the other hand, we tell you that even if they are worried about the economy, strengthening the military is not going to solve problems, because in 50 years we're not going to have enough people to sustain our pension funds, which are going to collapse the entire finances of the European Union. This is why we tell you that they invest in our local economies. I don't know, promote education, stop brain drain, stop letting people, create incentives for people to stay or come to the European Union rather than go to the United States. I don't know. Improve local industries, give incentives for larger childbirths that are going to actually create that are going to turn very little birth rates into birth rates that are sustainable for the country. From, I think, the European Union average of 1.6, we need to raise it to at least 2.1 to have a sustainable economy. So, Pat, what happens in this debate? Firstly, on the point of kind of this war safety, we tell you that everyone kind of just makes this large assertions about strength, power without any nuances, and then we tell you that we take it over them because we are, first of all, more realistic in terms of how NATO is incentivized to help Europe and how strong the European Union is by themselves, which they completely deny, and they don't engage with the realistic strength of the European Union, and we take it over our opening because we simply tell you that if 7 minutes of speech convince you that World War III is bound to happen because $800 billion are about to be spent, fine, but we simply believe that it is quite unlikely and that on the other hand, what is more likely is that NATO has a large incentive to help the European Union, and the European Union is strong by themselves. And then lastly, we tell you that if we spend this $800 billion and cut back on welfare, that's already not good enough to sustain the European economy, we're going to collapse it in the long term, ending up with nothing irregardless. Thank you.